We also want to share a disclaimer. This session is intended to be informational and educational and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. Consult your legal, healthcare, or financial advisor for advice regarding your personal situation. AARP is not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken in reliance upon or as a result of the information provided during this event. Today, we are joined by Kevin Asato, Executive Director of the National Black Brewers Association. Kevin is a 30-year beverage industry expert with diverse experience in adult beverage, non-alcoholic beverages, and carbonated soft drinks. He is credentialed as a certified spirit specialist. Ooh, I can't wait to learn what that is. Kevin is committed to developing minority leaders and improving racial inequalities in the beverage industry. He was selected as the first executive director of the National Black Brewers Association to help build the foundation to fuel the growth of Black-owned breweries, increase membership into the organization, and celebrate the history and accomplishments of the Black Brewers of America. Kevin has been recognized as the 2023 Beer Champion of the Year, 2024's most influential people in craft beer, and 2024's top 75 people in adult beverage. Kevin, welcome. We can't wait to hear your presentation.
My goodness, Jacqueline, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. And my goodness, may I thank the entire AARP team, my goodness, for welcoming me and inviting me to speak to all of you. Um, as I heard, my goodness, we are touching base with individuals from all across the country. So very exciting opportunities there. Really, really excited about having the opportunity to speak during Black History Month. So welcome. And as Jacqueline said, I've got a couple of years of experience in the adult beverage space there, and I won't bore you with the things that I've done, but suffice it to say that adult beverage, both beer, wine, and spirits, is absolutely my sweet spot and absolutely my passion point. And with passion, it never feels like work. At least that's what I've been told, and certainly what it has felt like. I've taken these 30 years to not just understand and drink, but quite frankly, to really understand the history behind beer, wine, and spirits. And with the current role as the executive director of beer for the National Black Brewers Association, it kind of brought my career full circle where I started actually in beer to begin with there. So I am very excited to share some of this information. And when I got the ads to see if there's some information that I could share and help all of you, either learn a little bit more about beer or quite frankly, find a beer that makes sense for you. Because I don't think everyone on this call is going to be a beer fan, but maybe coming away from here, you'll walk away with a little bit of knowledge um, that might make you one. And in short, when I met my wife, she was one of these prime people that did not have any interest in beer, none whatsoever. But I took her on a very similar path and a similar journey that all of you will be going on today. And, with some storytelling and quite frankly, with some nice sample of different types of beers, we found that she actually is a stout drinker. She likes dark beers, and that doesn't surprise me because she likes her black, strong, hot coffee. So I hope all of you have one of these, shared experiences as well. So I'm going to put up on the screen there a presentation I'm going to review with you today. And as the team has mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to put your information in the chat. And I think the team's going to be monitoring the chat. And all you have to do is let me know. And if I don't address a question in the main portion of the dialogue, I'll come back and speak to it a little bit later. So let's get going. So first and foremost, what we're going to go through today is some of the understanding of the beer fundamentals, the real basics there. And I recognize that for some of you, this will be a little bit repetitive and you may already have this knowledge. So, not trying to insult anybody's intelligence, but I'm just going to assume that there is a blank canvas we're working with. So we're going to give all the information from the beginning. We'll also review some of the variety of beer styles there, and there you'll see that there is more than enough beers for every type of flavor profile and preference. We'll walk through the cultural history and Black brewers, in beer. So this is going to be the fun side of the piece there that this organization was created with or for. And then we'll also do a little bit of personal taste and discovery. We are going to be a little bit handcuffed with our ability because I don't have beers in front of you, so you can try all of them, which is really the fun part of this part. But we'll talk through it nonetheless and share the information there. So, so understanding beer. The crazy thing is that there is a really simple piece there, and I know it's a little bit dark, right now, but beer is very simple. It is grain, hops, yeast, and water. Those four basic pieces is the foundation for any beer. Now, now how you manipulate it, whether how long you cook any one of those items, the different, mixture of how much volume of, of grain versus hops will start to determine how you actually get different types of beer. And so, that's what we're going to, really recognize here. Beer is very simple and dating back, and because of the simplicity, that's why history has continued to show us that beer has been around for thousands of years. Now, it may not be like the Budweiser that's in your refrigerator today or the beer you get at your local craft brewery, but it is absolutely made from the same ingredients where products have been, fermented, and this is how, grains and water would come together. And probably hops weren't used back in the early and the first versions of beer, but the natural yeast that circulates across, any of the agriculture in the area acts as the activating ingredient. And so what happens here when we talk about yeast, yeast actually eats the sugar that is released from the water and grain mixture. That yeast, when it starts to eat the sugar, creates, and that's the introduction of fermentation. And that, converting of sugar into alcohol is the first step of how you get that a little bit of that ethanol and methanol alcohol into beer that gives you that woohoo, that fun alcohol feeling there. Um, so know that, any variation or combination of these, four things there and the different styles, impart different flavor profiles and flavor preferences, different mouth feels, and how much alcohol relays in there also continues to play a role. Some of the other, introduction pieces there, there's only two types of beers. There's only ales and lagers. You heard me talking so much about yeast and how much that affects, all of the beer. Well, in short, if you've heard of an ale, the most simplistic definition is that, this is going to be a eating yeast. And all that you really need to take away from that dialogue is that it produces much more complex flavors. So when you think of a India Pale Ale, right, it's going to have a big flavor profile, lots of depth and high bitterness there, but, have, some notes of some fruit in the nose there as opposed to a lager. A lager is going to be cool. Doesn't cook as long, doesn't impart so many complexities within any of the ingredients there. So as a result, it results in a very clean, crisp taste. When you think of a lager, think these large, big beers, like the Budweisers, the Millers, the Coors of the world. Those are all lagers, all right? We affectionately call those yellow beers, but they are light, not terribly complex, and very easy drinking. We'll dive down a little bit deeper into, the ales versus lagers, but know that those are the first two categories that beer starts to break out and separate in, and that's just the yeast differentiation there. But as I mentioned before, and as I talked about, we talk about our most common and, styles of beers and light beers. We probably all could have had it. I don't know if anybody remembers the very first light beer that came out. Um, Obviously, there's no response here, so we'll give you guys a little bit of a break. But in short, it is Miller Lite. That was the most popular beer, and I don't know if you remember the tagline from many moons ago, back in the early 70s. Tastes great, less filling, right? And they used to have all the football players, fighting about which made more sense. I drink the beer because it tastes great, or I drink the beer because it's less filling. Those ads still resonate loud with me, albeit I was a little young when those commercials first came out, but it still was great to see all the football legends talking about beer. And maybe that was my first big love affair with, beer, seeing me on my, on-field idols talking about something. And I didn't know what it was, but it seemed like they were having a lot of fun doing it. So, um, suffice it to say, light beer has become, the fastest growing and the largest beer section in American beer today. But you've also seen the amber ales, wheat beers, stouts like Guinness, porters and bitter IPAs, which is the particular type of beer that is the most popular in craft. You know, and then as I announced all these pieces there, you're probably saying, Kev, well then how do I know what each one tastes like? Well, fortunately for you, I'm going to send you all with a little bit of a flavor grid so you can actually understand as you talk about a porter or come across a porter, you'll have this little handy dandy reference card to give you some of what the flavor profile should be and what some of the flavors will, be when you experience it and what some of the imagery and what some of the good partnerships of food are a good pairing with. So, but just know, I think the biggest takeaway here and the biggest message that we want to lean away from here is the fact that, you know, there are different beer styles for every personal palate and every personal style. So just like you may have experienced last year in the conversation with last February with the wine group and how there is a ton of varieties of wine, beer is the same fact that there are so many different styles of beer that even though you may not have come across a beer that you have liked today, maybe it's just waiting around the corner. So we got to get you to a brewery to give that a try. So let's dive down a little deeper into some of this other terminology you probably have heard. You probably have heard terms like domestic, import, and craft. So I'm going to try and demystify some of the stuff really simply by saying domestic beers are any beers brewed in the U.S. by large producers. And when I say large producers, I go back to some of those names you've heard readily and frequently, right? The Budweisers, the Michelob Ultra, the Coors, the Miller Lights. Those are considered the domestic heavyweights, and quite frankly, they are the largest beer producers in the world there. They represent in the US 62% of all beer. So, yeah, you can roughly say almost two out of every three beers sold are a domestic beer. It represents about 106 million barrels. That, what do you call abbreviation BBLs? That is a beer barrel nomenclature. Thank God none of you can raise your hand and answer this question. But if any of you went to college or seen the frat parties or went to sorority party there and you did a keg stand, and those big round circular beer kegs, that's actually a half barrel. How we measure beer globally and to make sure everyone has the same measuring tool is actually the equivalent of two of those half kegs. So when I talk about a half, talking about a barrel here, a BBL, beer barrels, whew, tongue twister. That's 31 gallons of beer. So you can imagine just doing some simple math. If there's 106 million barrels being produced and sold times 31 gallons, my goodness, the U.S. is one of the largest consumers of beer in the world. And so that's one of the takeaways here there. You may have heard, across as I spoke about beer, wine, and spirits, God, which one of those sells the most? Do more US people or is there more volume in beer, wine, or spirits? Well, beer has been the king in terms of volume and remains the king even today in terms of volume across those three different types of adult beverage. So, yeah, it starts to give some context on how big some of these companies are, like I just mentioned on the domestic side. Then you've also heard of imports. And as the name you suggest, those are products that are brewed outside the U.S. and brought into the U.S. for Americans to drink there. The brands like Modelo, Heineken, Guinness, Sapporo, Labatt, and even Corona. You've all heard those names, probably even shared, some of those, in your past there. But it is now Modelo that has become the number one beer. This actually represents a 24% market share. So when I look at the domestic and import universe, that's 86% of all beers consumed in the US. And I point that out in particular because I go back to that conversation we just had about ales and lagers, right? The majority of these beers that are listed here in the domestic and import are going to be light lagers and very light crisp beers there. Of course, we understand the Guinnesses of the world, that is a very clear stout, and we understand that, but the overwhelming majority of beer that is consumed in the US is a light lager, which introduces craft beer. How many of you remember maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago that everywhere you turned, people were talking about, hey, I went to this brewery. Hey, I got a brewery opening up in this town. Or someone brought over a big old glass jug of, hey, I got this filled up. Or they had some crazy labeled beer in a 16-ounce can that looked like somebody glued on or something like that, right? It just wasn't as crisp as perhaps a can of Budweiser or whatnot. But that was the introduction of craft beer. Craft beer was such a huge, huge introduction in beer. And today it represents, 13% of all beer sold, 22 million barrels. When you think of some of the brands that are in craft that are popular today, the Sam Adams of the world, New Belgium, Brooklyn Brewery, and of course the largest of craft beer is Yingling Lager. Um, the unique point of difference between the craft beer products and the domestic and imports that I just talked about being light and crisp, craft beer is much bolder and complex in flavors, right? So all of a sudden now, here's this massive introduction about 20, 25 years ago of people making beers that are so different from what the larger US has been accustomed to, and people were taking notice. And they're like, wow, but in addition to all these beers becoming available, the introduction of the microbrewery and the beer pub became very prevalent. And it became kind of a communal meeting spot, right? Where you can actually be okay with saying, hey, I don't know everything about beer, but I'd like to try. And if any of you have ever been to a craft brewery spot, one of the few things that they offer even today in other more established locations, they offer flights of beer. Those flights of beer were a great tool to educate so many people of the various different styles of beer. It introduced people into the porters and the stouts and the pale ales, the India pale ales, the hazy or juicy pale ales, and on and on goes the names of beers that people now had access to and felt comfortable enough to say, I don't know what that is over there, but I'll give it a try, and I don't have to order a 12 pack to try it. I can get perhaps a 6-ounce taster. So this 25 years ago was such a huge, huge introduction to beer of bringing in such new players into beer that that's where beer really had its largest growth opportunity. Since then, it's continued to diminish with some of the things that we experience today that we never heard of before, such as gluten sensitivity, right? If you have a gluten sensitivity or a celiac, affliction, you will see that you're not really a fan of beer because, how it can disrupt you. Quite frankly, even with the introduction of cannabis being a lot more accessible, there are people that are saying, well, I won't drink. I'll go ahead and either consume cannabinoids in some capacity there. So as we're starting to lose some of the normal or the audience of beer, know that still, despite all that, beer still remains the largest segment of adult beverage there. So I unloaded a lot. I'll pause there so you guys can, and I'll check the chat, see if there's any questions that I need to address. I think we're okay. Yeah. Alrighty. Oh, did I miss I think I lost it here. Here we go. All right. So I talked a lot about beer, talked a ton about it there. And so how do you know what works for you? Well, as I mentioned before, my wife, she liked, this Guinness stout because it was very coffee-like, and that's actually kind of a bittering, product there. Well, for me, I like something that's kind of sweet. And, given that I may drink, more than one or two, we'll kind of be sitting around or maybe with the meal. Man, not all stouts make sense for me there. So, it was always good that we could actually have a couple different types of beer, but we never, my wife wouldn't naturally know how to, figure that out just yet. So we had to start, imparting with her, understanding some of the flavor preferences. As you have seen, our tastes evolve over time. What we liked when we were 21 is different than what we liked at 40 and different than we liked at 60. So I'll tell you personally, I still like the sweet stuff. So I still like, the less bitter beers for certain there. So that hasn't changed across, my 55 years on this planet there. Um, but, recognizing that, even though your flavor profiles may change and perhaps your needs may change, there's actually a beer that can kind of live in that space for you. So let's talk about what some of those differences are. Alcohol content. It's not a real surprise right now that some, maybe doctor's orders or maybe the simple fact that you don't want to get, entirely too impaired, but you still very much enjoy the flavor of beer. Well, one of the biggest growth areas of beer is non-alcoholic beer. And the technology that has become available to actually make non-alcoholic beer taste like beer. I mean, I remember some of the early beer offerings with no alcohol. I think one was called Near Beer. And then a little bit later, there was something called, O'Doul's and Sharps, that was a little bit better, but still lacked that really good mouthfeel and that good, satiation of what a beer should taste like. But nowadays, my goodness, craft beer breweries are making it, and Guinness has a non-alcoholic. Heineken does. All the major beer companies have really good non-alcoholic beers, and that was never a consideration just a handful of years ago. But now, if we want to limit, our impairment, but still want to enjoy the taste of beer, you have a massive audience there. There's even some companies that are solely dedicated to creating non-alcoholic products, and that's a company like Athletic Beer. And I will tell you, Athletic makes a remarkable non-alcoholic product. I mean, they make very good beer. Then there's some context, on the beer selection there. Maybe, as we talked about, socializing, relaxing, or pairing with meals, that will also dictate, your decision. As I talked about before, maybe you do have a gluten sensitivity, and 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a gluten-free beer. Now there's an absolute, whole segment of gluten-free and gluten-sensitive beers. So beer has evolved. As we talk about beer as a part of culture, beer has evolved with, the humans' needs and the humans' desires. And, if you haven't found yours yet, hopefully some of this introduction to some of the different types of beers that are out there will actually get you to give it a whirl there. And as I mentioned before, the exploration and enjoyment, that's exactly it. All the education came a lot through, the craft beer and brew pubs that were out there. Now you don't even have to go that far. You can actually go to your Total Wine or Bevmos of the world or your various, liquor stores or state-owned stores, depending on where you're at, and they have a very exhaustive offering of beers there. And so, hopefully, some of this information and that we shared today will help you, you know, jump on out to the store and try something new. So this is what I call, the handy dandy little cheat sheet. This will be shared with all of you. But this is where most beers would fall into. And when you talk about a flavor profile, as we just, said, whether you like sweet, bitter, high alcohol, low alcohol, what does it work well with food and whatnot? This is a good guide for you to work with there. So how this guide works is simple. If you're looking for something light, crisp, and refreshing, that is a, clean, mild, and subtle taste. These are some of the common characteristics you'll see, that low bitterness, crisp, easy drinking there. Then you're going to look for a beer that's going to be like a light lager, an American lager, a Pilsner, a Kolsch, or a cream ale. These are, in large part what a lot of those Budweiser, Millers, and Coors, kind of that fall into that space there. And, it gives you some suggestions, so if you're a relatively new drinker looking to ease into some things, warm weather, that's exactly what this works for. And you'll see that across the board that this is, a good tool to kind of walk you through and to give yourself a try. So even if you, go down, to your local beer aisle in your store and you look down at these beer styles, you can kind of refer back to this piece there. If you saw something of, wow, I don't know what a double IPA is or a West Coast IPA. Well, you can know that it's, it's a bit hoppy, and you say, Kev, what's hoppy? Well, I'll pause here to address that because this is hops are the one thing that it's produced and used for. It's just for beer. 90% of the hop production in the world is only for beer. The less 1% is for a nutraceutical, but does anyone have any idea why hops were introduced into beer? Short answer is this. It was the early days natural preservative. It was what you know, lengthen the life of beer before it turned and spoiled, right? As long as yeast is in this beer, it's constantly alive and working there. So the hoppy bitter beer actually was a introduction to the first preservatives, food preservatives there. And now you can determine how hoppy a beer is, and I'm going to spend a little time with this because it's such a significant portion of the beer culture, particular hoppiness and the hops. You'll even notice it in the NV2A logo coming up. It's a very pronounced, profile of a hop flower. But I'm spending time here is because it's such a significant component of agriculture that is only used for beer. It is also what is, one of the more distinctive flavoring aspects of beer. And if you are looking at something for bitterness, if you really appreciate bitterness, there is a standard by which you can determine how high or how strong or how intense the bitterness is. It's called a BTU. It's a bitterness unit. Sometimes on the can it will say even just a BU, but it stands for bitterness taste unit or bitterness unit. The higher that number, so if it's at a 10 or 20, know that it will make you almost pucker. It is that bitter that if you were to take a sip of it, you'll feel that natural, perhaps not as acidic as a lemon, but it'll be strong up there, and you'll get that very significant aroma of that bitterness that almost mirrors that of the marijuana. Actually, oddly enough, marijuana and hops are from the same family, albeit no hallucinogenic, impact from hops. But because they're from the same family, the more intense and high bitterness unit content beer will almost have that, that slight skunk marijuana smell. The lower bitterness products there, they won't make you pucker, but if you like that, very bold flavor product, you're going to look for something in about that 4 to 5, bitterness unit level. Okay. So a lot there, but once again, I think this will be one of your biggest takeaways, one of your biggest partners as you're out in the world trying various things there. And if you don't understand some of these words, believe me, I can't even say some of these words myself there, but a lot of them are German based, in terms of some of these names here. But, it's pretty fun to go out and go to your local brew pub. And if you're traveling, it's very easy to find a craft brew location there, and there's definitely some cities and towns that really embrace craft beer, and they may have multiple locations in one. So you'll have that opportunity. I will grant you, it may not be as luxurious and beautiful as a Napa, California, or the Champagne region of France, but suffice it to say, there is a ton of history and a ton of education and a willing population to help you select and find a beer that makes sense for you there. So as we move on to the history of black brewers in America, this is where things, are still very exciting and good, but it's not that, you're probably wondering, well, I haven't heard of many beers in America, and that's kind of understandable. As you look at this photo here, we have the African continent in which beer is traditionally assigned to the origins of being in Africa. We don't like to say that beer was born in Africa because there were so many civilizations that actually had a version of or their version of beer across the country. China had theirs, Europe had theirs, but definitely, the earliest known facts and earliest recipe that is on the books is that from, the Egypt and Mesopotamia regions. So in casual conversation, many people say that the birthplace of beer is in Africa, but I don't think anybody can say definitively, proof positive that beer wasn't produced elsewhere. It just perhaps wasn't recorded in the same way that we can find that proof, in Africa. But the history of blacks there, in Africa, as I mentioned before, beer is water, grain, and yeast for the most part, and then hops are added later as a preservative. In Africa, the women were the ones that did the bulk of the brewing. It was historically, captured that, females of the families were actually some of the best brewmasters ever. And so you can imagine that, that this became just indoctrinated as using beer as currency and using beer as celebratory activities to bring people together, maybe different tribes, different groups of people. But beer was that social conduit to bring people together. And that was no different for, that of, where some of the current brewing traditions live today. So while there are 86 Black-owned breweries today in America, those African brewing traditions aren't terribly different from what we know beer of today. We typically get comfortable with the fact that, oh, wow, the Germans and the European style of beer making, they're the ones that did it. Well, not a surprise there. That is the American, model of beer in that German style of beer, the lager. As I talked to you before, you talked about, Budweiser, Miller, Coors as being the lead and driving almost two-thirds of all beer sold. Well, think about that. Adolphus Busch, Austrian. Adolf Coors, German. These icons of beer brought those brewing traditions into the US, and their communities were able to flourish in the northern portion of the US. As we all know, blacks were brought into the US as slaves. So we didn't necessarily have the same, while we had the same knowledge as the Europeans, we weren't free to ply our trade and create breweries to earn money. Now, where those traditions did come across, they still absolutely were still very much with, the slave culture and the slave community, but they also were able to have some early success in creating brewers across the country. But as you can imagine, when Prohibition hit, and social and economic challenges where they were faced with, there weren't many independent and entrepreneurial businesses that were able to, make it past some of the challenges that they were facing there. And of course, the impact of prohibition and segregation limited some of the additional impacts of growth of black breweries there. It's not to say, once again, that the knowledge wasn't there and the passion wasn't there and the history and the culture behind it wasn't there. It very much was there. And so that cultural heritage and recognition, it's just at this stage, we give a lot of credit to the European style of beer as opposed to the history of the black brewers that connects beer to community. So when you think about craft brewers in America, there are nearly 10,000 breweries in America. Nearly 10,000 across the craft, domestic, and imported beers. Just in America, there's nearly 10,000. But today, less than 1% of all craft breweries are black owned. Now, it doesn't matter what demographic benchmark you use, whether it's 13% of African Americans in the US or 23% of African Americans who drink beer of the total US there. Either way you look at it, that seems to be a woefully low number where only less than 1% of all craft breweries owned are black owned. But it is because of something like that the NB2A exists. The National Black Brewers Association, our primary focus is to increase the expand the presence of black brewers in the US there. You know, I'll pause here real, quickly here, not just because of the economic inequity that exists and some of the natural barriers that existed and that black owners were faced with. You know, we know that the systemic racism has taken place in this industry like it has taken place in several other industries there. So we weren't unique onto ourselves and we weren't faced with our challenges. And these are some of the very real obstacles and barriers for having a larger presence of black-owned breweries. But I will tell you, though, that the organization like National Black Brewers, we are trying to celebrate the fact that there are not only currently 86 black-owned breweries in the US, but there are, I think, 13 more in planning, meaning they're getting their license, they're pulling together their equipment to start having that in place. Why do we do this there? Well, I talked a lot about how this is a community impact component there. And I'll even pause here and kind of divert a little bit. In the US, 70% of consumers are either people of color or women, right? And then I'll even, point out the fact that, wow, that's such a significant audience there. Well, if there's so many, how come there aren't beers that were created and born from that universe or that population? Well, there's some barriers that we just talked about. But let's dive a little bit further on why we're seeing such growth in the black breweries as opposed to the growth that we're seeing in other breweries. I mean, right now, black brewers are the fastest growing beer segment in beer. That's phenomenal. And it's not because they're doing something so terribly different. Quite frankly, is that they're embracing their culture. When you think about, black culture is no longer considered black culture when you talk about music, fashion, sports. You know, think about it. Hip hop was a quote unquote black focused cultural, expression. Now you can't go into a professional sports stadium without some version of hip hop. Or my goodness, I know Bad Bunny is Hispanic, but last year Kendrick Lamar and all the other major sporting events had my goodness hip hop playing, right? It's in between the plays and the whole nine. And my goodness, who would have ever thought Snoop Dogg was going to be the commentator for the Olympics? Snoop Dogg. But that is a prime example of how Black culture is no longer uniquely ours. It is now part of everyday American culture, right? Things that, used to be uniquely ours, are absolutely embraced. And the same thing holds true for fashion, right? I mean, how many kids, wanted to be like Mike and wear Mike Jordans? Now, my goodness, you can throw a stick at how many people have and hit somebody wearing Michael Jordans. Heck, you can see a CEO of a company wearing Michael Jordan shoes there or Jordans. You know, the whole thing being is that culturally speaking, the Black culture is now becoming more and more a part of American culture, and that's exactly what's taking place in beer, and that's what's fueling, the popularity of Black brewers today. As I mentioned before, the brewing techniques are inherently the same, whether you're European, African, Asian, you name it. The brewing techniques are inherently the same, but what we introduce uniquely from there is that sense of community coming together, right? That the breweries end up being a place of individuals of like-minded, like lifestyles coming together. But they also introduce perhaps some of the ingredients and strains of hops or strains of yeast that were exposed to an audience from their community of the past. So that's what helps bring in new flavors. So flavors that are unique, to you know, hibiscus as a key one there. Mango plays a big part in there. These aren't unique only to the Black community, but these are things that are prevalent. And so these differences and combined with the community coming together really are the drivers of, bringing growth. So the Brewers Association, National Black Brewers Association, and we're focused on, career advancement and economic equity for African American brewing professionals and business owners, and encourages the full engagement of Black Americans within the American brewing community. So I'm very grateful that Kevin Johnson, the founder of this organization, the former NBA All-Star and Mayor of Sacramento, who doesn't even drink, but when he started this organization, um, he realized that there was not an organization, a trade association there to support the unique issues bestowed upon the Black brewers in the community. So he galvanized the entire Black community, brought them together, and said, "Hey, we're going to have an organization in support of your business efforts there." On the screen, you'll see the logo for us and that nice circular logo in the green, that's a hop flower that you see there, and so that's why it's so prevalent in, the beer community. But you'll see our website there, www.mb2a.org. That is something that, you can go to our website and actually get a lot more information, much more in-depth information, not only regarding our mission statement, but to learn more about who we are and what we do. A couple of things that I like to point out is, the work that we've done. We've created National Black Brewers Day, and it's affectionately started, October 10th. So 10/10 is the National Black Brewers Day. And the significance of that date is simple. It is the date that the first Black-owned craft brewery in the United States was opened by Ted Mack in 1970. Sadly, after 2 years amidst civil unrest and a fair amount of, social challenges, that brewery closed. But we still recognize that he had the wherewithal and the courage to blaze that trail to be the first craft-owned brewery there. So we pay homage and give him visibility. And what this association does, we will work with the various state level legislation or county or city level legislation to recognize this day as National Black Brewers Day. So, like, for example, the state of California, the state of New York, the state of Louisiana, and Texas all recognize October 10th as National Black Brewers Day. So let's make sure this October 10th we raise a black-owned beer in support of the work of Ted Mack. But some of the work that we've also done, we're working with the Congressional Black Congress to actually, and we have it on House Resolution Bill 1297 to make it a federally recognized day. So we really appreciate all the support of any individual that has helped us get to this point. But some of the other great things that this organization does, we also have the National Black Brewers Business Development Fund. And the reason why this is so significant, we provide grant assistance, financial assistance, to, breweries to actually, help break down the very systemic issues that prevented them from entering, right? So as you mentioned, as I said earlier, our goal is to increase the number of Black-owned breweries, and so this business development fund is exactly that. And so we're very fortunate to have such great supporters such as Amazon, U.S. Bank, the Boston Brewing Company, Roy Farms to be some of our more significant supporters to help, assist with this grant program. And then I also really strongly encourage, that you visit our website so that you can actually visit our Black Brewery directory. This is available, 24/7. So at your leisure, look at it. And as if you're traveling or if you want to look at what's in your home state and what's nearby you, you can see if there's a Black-owned brewery near you. But I'll also do a plug for the larger beer scope. The Brewers Association, which is the larger group that represents the 90 to the nearly 10,000 craft breweries, they too have a brewery directory. So I would recommend, and I'll share that information with you in this deck there to make sure that you have access to the breweries in yours. No, not just the ones that are black owned, but all craft breweries in the U.S. that are nearby you. So to wrap up, you know, beer is a cultural reflection. Not only represents culture and science and history and community, but it's also a reflection of your personal taste, reflecting human creativity and tradition. Um, I like how that's actually particularly said because there's so much that's involved, history, personal preference, time of day, you name it. But beer is as reflective as the individual itself. It respects the personal choice, of every individual and the personal preference there. And I strongly invite you to stay curious, learn more about it, learn more about beer. And more importantly, I appreciate your willingness to take time to learn a little bit more about beer and allow me to be that vehicle to share that with you today. So that's going to conclude our talk for today. And just remember, NB2A is bringing culture to the cup.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. You oh, gave us a lot of information.
A
So we're
lot. Yeah.
but it's good. We're going to go over to the chat, and Joyce, you're going to tell us get those questions answered.
All right. So, first of all, you did a great job with your presentation. I like that one. And when you talked about lager, one of the persons said, yeah, lager is like moosehead. I had never heard of moosehead before.
That's right. A
That
Canadian
was so good.
beer. Yeah.
This is like moosehead. So, Dee is asking, how does the IPAs get their flavor?
The most significant contribution to flavor for an IPA is the actual style of hop. There are over 10,000 different styles of hops, and they have cool names like Simcoe or Citra, but even some real scientific names like Lot 42 or BX14. These are small strains that impart just unique differences, and depending on how well you cook it or how long you cook it, how hot you cook it, can impart a different flavor. And so each one of these different strains of hops that are visible in an IPA may give off its unique characteristics. So depending on that strain, like I said, there are over 10,000 different versions, and that brewer, whatever he's feeling or smelling when he's cooking up his recipe is what it will impart. And that is what makes the difference from the different types of IPAs there.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that there are several different hops. When you think about hops in beer, I think, oh, wow, that's a lot going on, but I get it. Thank you for explaining that. There's another question. Now, you're talking about light beer versus dark beer. I know you kind of mentioned that. You have a particular flavor because I know you mentioned you and your wife kind of have some beer. What do you think, light or dark? What's your take?
Beer is so, it's just like music to me. There are times where I want to hear myself a little James Brown. There are times I want to hear a little Michael Jackson, and there are times where I want to hear some Najee, my personal jazz favorite there. It just kind of depends on my mood. There are times, just it holds true with beer as well. There are times where I do want a dark beer, a bolder flavored beer, but that dark beer doesn't always mean heavy. I think when I look at something like, I'll use Guinness as a prime example. Guinness actually has less calories than most American lagers. Even though it looks dark and heavy and it's going to weigh me down, calorically speaking, it's actually pretty light. Alcohol content is actually pretty low relative to any IPA. Most IPAs are going to be in that higher 6 to 7% alcohol by volume, and Guinness is not. It's in that 4%. So I I don't have a strong preference, just like I said, just probably like many of you listen to different types of music depending on your mood. I think, beer plays exactly that same way. So I do like both, just depending on
That's a,
my mood.
that's a good answer. Because if you had swayed one way or another, they would have said, "Oh, he's sad."
True statement.
Good answer, but I'm glad you said depending upon the mood
Mm,
will definitely make a difference. You talked a lot about not a lot, but a little bit about non-alcoholic beer, and
hmm
there's such a varieties of different types of non-alcoholic beers. And then I know you mentioned about what makes it alcoholic, but can you go over that one more time? What makes alcoholic beer alcoholic versus non-alcoholic? I know you talk about the hops and all of this stuff, but just one more time, just a little bit.
Absolutely. Fermentation is the production of alcohol. And the science side of things there is that yeast eats the sugars, that are created or, offered up from the grain and water mixture, right? Water will break down the proteins and sugars that are in the grain. Those sugars that exist are eaten up by the yeast, and that creates the alcohol. There's three different alcohols that are produced. Um, when you are making non-alcoholic beer, the first way to do that is allow beer to come, produce, create the alcohol, and then they would spin out, put it in a centrifuge to spin out alcohol. So it would leave all the liquid, but it would pull out the alcohol. Now, that was the older version of doing beer, and doing non-alcoholic beer. When you did that, so much of the mouthfeel that alcohol brings that perhaps you got used to and really enjoyed, that left. So it left you kind of wanting more when you would drink that non-alcoholic beer. The technologies today differ very much where they bring product almost to that fermentation point and then remove, and stop the yeast from, eating all that alcohol and allow the rest of the cooking process to move forward. They have found that that is given a more true comparison or likelihood to that of alcohol. So it is about controlling the fermentation process, is the modern day version there, or historically, basically taking out alcohol from an alcoholic product was the old process. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does because sometimes people say, I want to have a nice cold beer when I get
Mhm.
home. And if you're not an alcoholic drinker with beer, at least they can have a nice cold beer with a taste. I guess that's, pretty
And so
much what it
nowadays,
amounts to.
as I mentioned before, Heineken, Corona, the Mick Ultra Zero, there are so many. If you look for anything that says zero or 0.0, those will be your non-alcoholics and they're readily available. Whereas 20 years ago, it'd be tough to find. Now you could probably find a non-alcoholic beer and a good one at that on darn near any restaurant menu or darn near
Right.
any store.
Man, I've heard it. Just one more, or actually two more questions. Should do you prefer your beer cold or warm? Some people say when they get home, I want a nice cold beer, and other people say no, I want it strong and hot. So, what do you think? What's your take?
You're right. If I'm outdoors and doing yard work or I there's nothing tastier than an ice cold beer. I can't tell you it's better than water. It absolutely is. So ice cold is for me. Ice cold beer.
The
I think
last question is: are any tips for those who are interested in home brewing as a hobby? Hobby, that's the key. Not where they're gonna start making it and selling it.
Well, the crazy thing is, darn near every craft brewer started as a home brewer. Darn near every single one. And so they actually have kits. You sell in 5 gallon water jugs, with all the ingredients there to make a batch at home. Sometimes they call it bathtub, beer or something like that there, but they absolutely have home brewing kits, and you can go online and look at it there. Um, they sell you the ingredients straight away, so your first batch you don't have to really think too much. It is what it is, and then once you do that, then that same location that you bought the equipment from, they have the other ingredients, other types of hops, other types of grains to make your particular style of beer. And there's recipes online, easily accessible online, and I would even recommend joining your local home brewing club. You would be surprised, but there are over 200,000 home brewing Americans that actually are part of the American Home Brewing Association. So, connect with that association there, because they have a website of a lot of the great introductory pieces. So that would be my best tip there, the American Home Brewers Association. I'll go ahead and send some of this information, when I send this presentation on over on how to reach that audience there. But that'd be a great resource for home brewing needs.
Oh, thank you so very much. And I'm glad you put that chart in so that when they go to the stores, they'll have an idea of, this I want it bitter, I want it sweet, I want it, that type of thing. So thank you again for the chart. So any closing remarks on your end that you like, that burning question that you want to answer that I forgot to answer?
I wouldn't say burning questions there, but I will tell you that I felt like I can talk like this or about this for 10 hours. So I apologize if I'm rushed. I will make myself available to any of your members that have a question. My email is kevin@nb2a.org. I'll go ahead and continue to send that information, and feel free to share it with your audience and your members. Happy to connect with them. Um, but I will also just say, hey, the craziest thing is, or fun factoid, beer and whiskey are born from the same products. So if you're a beer lover, you'll probably like whiskey. And if you're a whiskey lover, you'll probably like beer. Yeah,
I love it. That's a great tip. Thank you so very much. Back to you, Jacqueline. And thanks again, Kevin, for being here.
you bet.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Kevin. That was very interesting. I learned a lot. So join us next month for Tea and Coffee Tuesday on March 10th for our next program, where we will be joined by Andrew Broderick, co-director of the San Francisco Tech Council, to talk about age tech, digital technology that's designed around the needs and wants of older adults. Whew, that's a good one to tune into. If you would like to view previous programs or learn more about the Tea and Coffee Tuesday monthly series, check out the link that has been put in the chat. Again, thank you so much to Kevin for today's excellent presentation. Thank you to our Tea and Coffee Tuesday volunteers, Harash, Connie, Joyce, Vince, and as well as our AARP staff always. And of course, thank all of you for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and you learned a lot. I'm your AARP volunteer host, Jacqueline Cole. That concludes our program for today. I hope each of you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and go try some beer.